Good evening. I want to thank everyone for joining me for this presentation, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment. I'm glad that Jacob Hornberger and the Future of Freedom Foundation commissioned this presentation from me. I believe it's the most important JFK presentation I've ever made. You'll have the luxury of stopping this recording whenever you wish and examining the slides with a lot of text in tremendous detail, if that's what you would like to do. Or you'll have the option of just proceeding and following the oral narrative, which will cover most of the main points in the slides. So without any further ado, let's get started. So this presentation is an overview from 30,000 feet. John Newman presented on March 17th for this conference, and the title of his presentation was JFK and the Cold War, Deception, Treachery, and the Struggle for Power. If his presentation was a view from 10,000 feet, which is the way he described it, then my presentation attempts to be a grand overview of JFK's struggles with the national security state from an even higher altitude. This is a big picture presentation. What matters today is the who and the why. That's how I feel about it. Don't remain forever focused upon events in Dealey Plaza, or even on the minutiae of the conflicts in the medical evidence. Once you are convinced that there was a crossfire in Dealey Plaza, and therefore a conspiracy, and once you are convinced that the military autopsy was intentionally fraudulent, all that really matters going forward is the who, and more importantly, the why of JFK's assassination. It's natural to begin in Dealey Plaza, as we all once did, and then move on to the many conflicts in the medical evidence, as many of us have done. But you don't want to stay there forever. In my view, only the big questions make this subject worthy of continuing study and interest. So what is this thing called the national security state that Jacob's conference is about, and that JFK researchers are so fond of talking about? Well, the national security state began with the National Security Act of 1947. That act created the National Security Council, the Office of Secretary of Defense, officially created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although they had been meeting during World War II. They weren't called that. Now it was an official body, and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Now, a key National Security Council directive was promulgated on July 18, 1948, which justified numerous future abuses of power. It was called NSC 10/2. In this policy document, the U.S. intelligence community was authorized to carry out a broad range of covert operations, including propaganda, economic warfare, sabotage, and subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements and guerrillas. NSC 10/2 authorized violations of international law and therefore official lying as an indispensable cover. This was called plausible deniability. Now, plausible deniability meant that such covert activities had to be, quote, so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly deny any responsibility for them, end quote. So you see, the policy of plausible deniability, as Jim Douglas says, combined lying with hypocrisy. Now, this next slide is about the document promulgated by the NSC in April 1950 called NSC 68. This formalized a strategy of containment of the Soviet Union, in particular military containment, and a permanent peacetime arms buildup, in particular of nuclear weapons. My primary source for this discussion here is a publication by the National Defense University at Fort McNair in 1994 titled NSC 68, Forging the Strategy of Containment. It contained all the documents pertaining to NSC 68, and much of the text was written by Paul Nitze himself, the author of NSC 68. So it was an invaluable resource in determining his mindset at the time and his mindset years later. So this all began with the USSR's detonation of its first atomic bomb, a small fission device, in August of 1949. This was at least 3 years and possibly even 5 years earlier than expected. And it meant that the US had lost its nuclear monopoly. And this loss of our nuclear monopoly was the stimulus for NSC 68. So here's how it went down. On January 31st, 1950, President Truman decided to proceed with the development of the super, which became known as the hydrogen bomb. Now, the hydrogen bomb is a much more powerful weapon than a fission bomb. The fission bombs dropped on Japan. It's what we call a thermonuclear fusion device. In connection with this decision, he directed that the Secretaries of State and Defense re-examine U.S. objectives in peace and war and our strategic plans in view of the USSR's current atomic bomb capability and its likely ability to build a hydrogen bomb itself in the near future. So this directive of his to develop the hydrogen bomb and to re-examine all of our strategic plans is what led to NSC 68. The primary author was Paul Nitze, a civilian hawk who at the time was in the State Department. He was its brainchild, and his co-author and major supporter, if you will, was Secretary of State Dean Acheson. So NSC 68 was issued April 7th, 1950. It called for a, quote, rapid and sustained buildup of political, economic, and military strength of the free world, end quote, to counter the perceived intent by the USSR to dominate the world. A conclusion reached earlier in 1948 by a document called NSC 20/4, and which was the underlying assumption behind the urgent need for a massive peacetime arms buildup, especially in nuclear weapons. In April of 1950, NSC 68 reiterated the USSR's perceived intent to dominate the world and called for a massive arms buildup during peacetime, before the Korean War began, when defense expenditures were low and when Truman was considering further defense cuts. Now, NSC 68 declared that 1954 would be the year of maximum danger when the USSR would have enough fission bombs to seriously damage the United States, and recommended rapid stockpiling of American nuclear weapons to counter this threat. This gave birth to an overwhelming American nuclear superiority throughout the mid to late 1950s and early 1960s, and the serious temptation to use it. Truman was initially skeptical about NSC 68 before the Korean War started, but once that conflict began in June of 1950, and he got sucked into the Korean War and a major US commitment there, he viewed the communist world differently as a monolithic threat. And so on September 30th, 1950, he approved the text of NSC 68. And then after the NSC did some further economic studies on the ability of the United States to support a permanent war economy during peacetime, and nuclear stockpiling. Then on December 16th, he issued Presidential Proclamation 2914, declaring a state of national emergency and calling upon the American people to make the necessary sacrifices to implement NSC 68's strategy of global containment of the Soviet Union and counter what he called, quote, world conquest by communist imperialism, end quote, by funding massive and continuing increases in national defense. Now, it was Dean Acheson that wanted Truman to declare a state of national emergency. And he had to work on him, most of the year, but he got his wish. And this is what NSC 68 in its essentials was all about. It's about the bomb. The loss of America's nuclear monopoly in August of 1949 led to paranoia, a war economy during peacetime, and the rapid stockpiling of strategic nuclear weapons to dangerous levels. NSC 68 led to the obsessive stockpiling of nuclear weapons and delivery systems, long-range bombers, and in-flight refueling tankers. And one peril of this overwhelming and increasing dominance during the mid to late 1950s became the overwhelming temptation to use them, which reached its culmination in 1961 and 1962. Many of the conflicts between JFK and his national security establishment revolved around the cavalier attitude toward their use within the Pentagon and among civilian hawks. That theme is endemic during Kennedy's presidency. Now, here are Hawks Paul Nitze and Dean Acheson, the authors of NSC 68. They deliberately exaggerated the Soviet threat to justify massive increases in defense spending to maintain US nuclear superiority. That's what NSC 68 was all about. Now, Richard Rhodes, our foremost historian of the development of nuclear weapons and of the arms race in the 1950s and 60s, has written a wonderful book called Arsenals of Folly. And in it, he comes right out and says that Paul Nitze and Dean Acheson, the two foremost State Department hawks, both engaged in threat inflation with regard to the USSR, according to Rhodes. And Dean Acheson later said, quote, the purpose of NSC 68 was to so bludgeon the mass mind of top government that not only could the president make a decision, but that the decision could be carried out, end quote. Thus, the bludgeon that Acheson spoke of was Nitze's intentional exaggeration of the Soviet threat. NSC 68 painted the USSR not only as a source of implacable evil, but greatly exaggerated the military threat posed by the USSR, which was a nation exhausted by World War II. More about this later. So after 1954, the year of maximum danger forecast by NSC 68 passed without any attack from the USSR, the fears of Soviet nuclear power were kept alive by the Gaither Committee, a group of civilians appointed by President Eisenhower to study questions about building a massive civil defense system against nuclear attack. The Gaither Committee went rogue and exceeded its mandate by studying the issues originally considered by NSC 68, thanks to committee member Paul Nitze, who was a member of the Gaither Committee. The new year of maximum danger, according to the Gaither Committee, would be 1959. Its November 7th, 1957 report greatly exaggerated the threat posed by future Soviet ICBMs and heavy bombers. But Eisenhower was unpersuaded. Its recommendations included increasing our intermediate range nuclear missiles from 60 to 240, increasing our intercontinental ballistic missiles, our ICBMs, from the plan for 80 to 600, increasing military spending by 50%, building a massive system of civilian fallout shelters, nuclear fallout shelters, and increasing the alert posture of the Strategic Air Command, which was already quite high. So the Gaither report was followed immediately by widespread public fears of a missile gap, promoted by US Air Force intelligence and numerous journalists, which became an integral part of the 1960 presidential campaign. Eisenhower was unpersuaded, but many people in the Air Force really thought there was a missile gap, and many of the conservative journalists believed it too. Meanwhile, historian Jim Douglas writes that under Allen Dulles, appointed deputy director of the CIA in 1951 and director of Central Intelligence in 1953, the CIA interpreted NSC Directive 10/2 of 1948 and plausible deniability as a green light to overthrow governments, plan for the assassination of foreign leaders, and lie to cover up any trace of accountability, all for the sake of promoting US interests in general, and more specifically, its holy war against communism, which was perceived as bent on worldwide domination. Paranoia about the USSR had morphed into a jihad against any left-leaning governments and any leader critical of or even neutral toward the US or its business interests was viewed by the national security establishment as a communist threat. Two governments overthrown by the CIA under Dulles were both democratically elected governments. The Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, in 1953, and the President of Guatemala, Arbenz, in 1954. Later, during his second term, Eisenhower ordered Dulles to arrange for the assassination of two heads of government, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo and Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. The source for this disturbing information is John Newman in volume 2 of his JFK Assassination series titled Countdown to Darkness. He documents this very carefully. President Eisenhower felt this was necessary to get both NATO and Latin American support for the future US assassination of the revolutionary new Cuban leader, Fidel Castro. Although Eisenhower opposed large conventional force buildups and was not persuaded by the hysteria of the Gaither report, he did believe in the policies espoused by NSC 10/2 and the plausible deniability doctrine. And he did endorse the massive nuclear retaliation doctrine of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and the US Air Force. Now, under Eisenhower, Dulles began planning for regime change in Cuba by training anti-Castro guerrillas for infiltration into Cuba. This quickly morphed into a clandestine paramilitary invasion plan before Eisenhower left office in January of '61. This later became known as the Bay of Pigs. There are some pictures of Allen Dulles. The picture on the right is taken in 1961. And as you can see, he has an ice-cold personality. He was already very unhappy by this time because the Bay of Pigs had blown up in his face, and he knew he was simply waiting to be retired by JFK. Now, a few words about the inaugural address. There's a beautiful color image in the public domain. It was a 20-degree Fahrenheit day. JFK's inaugural speech was a rhetorical masterpiece. It was not a belligerent speech, as some historians have claimed. It was a well-balanced, carefully crafted appeal to reason that was both inspiring and uplifting and full of idealism. Kennedy not only promised to fulfill his Cold War responsibilities, but emphasized the theme of sacrifice with phrases like these: "The torch has been passed. Now the trumpet summons us again. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." It also expressed great concern about the dangers of the nuclear age and the importance of negotiations. And JFK proposed two ways for the US and USSR to cooperate with each other moving forward: arms control and space exploration. There's only one statement in the entire speech that could be interpreted as hardline or bellicose, and I'll read it to you here. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to ensure the survival and success of liberty, end quote. Now, there are reasons why this statement was inserted into the speech. First of all, Khrushchev had made a bellicose speech on January 6th, in which he declared the Soviet Union's intention to support national wars of liberation all over the globe. So Kennedy was focused on that and thought he had to counter that speech. He also sincerely believed he had to uphold his Cold War responsibilities, particularly with NATO. And not only that, I mean, he's replacing the revered General Eisenhower as president. And he's trying to reassure people that I'm going to do my duty. I know we're in the middle of a Cold War. I'm going to fulfill my responsibilities, particularly under the NATO alliance. So don't be concerned about that. And why did he feel he had to do that? Because his father, ambassador to Great Britain from 1937 to 1940, had been essentially an isolationist and a pacifist. So his father had supported the Munich Pact, in which Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain had given away part of Czechoslovakia to Adolf Hitler in 1938 to try to appease his desire for more territory. And after the fact, Joseph Kennedy supported the Munich Pact. So he was aware of these criticisms and was trying to reassure people that I'm not going to be an appeaser like my father. But the rest of the speech was very different in tone from this one statement. So I've listed here, I'm not going to read them to you. You can revisit this slide later if you wish, or you can freeze the picture now and read these. But the theme of sacrifice was emphasized in 3 different passages. And then JFK spent considerable amount of time talking about the dangers of nuclear war. Man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of poverty and all forms of human life. He requested that both sides begin anew the quest for peace before the dark powers of destruction unleashed by science engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. And then he talks some more about the dangers of having all these weapons and says, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And then went on to propose some ways to cooperate with the USSR. It's worth visiting these in detail later and reading the text. I think it's very moving. So as you view this presentation going forward, ask yourself this: what were JFK's opponents thinking about him each step along the way as the policy debates on Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, Berlin, and nuclear weapons were unfolding? And what was he thinking about them? But more importantly, what were they thinking about him, the new commander-in-chief that's replaced the revered General Eisenhower? So this is my summary slide for 1961. It's a little bit busy, but we need to go through this slide together. So let's do it and then move on to some of the specifics. JFK did experience a year of crisis in 1961. He was inexorably pushed toward war all year long in Cuba and Southeast Asia, while the confrontation with the USSR over Berlin threatened to go nuclear. In the Bay of Pigs crisis from April 17th through the 20th, JFK was himself the target of a covert operation designed to get him to commit US combat troops to bail out an exile invasion, which everyone in the CIA and Pentagon knew would fail on its own. It was a perfect failure, And the Bay of Pigs crisis became the major fault line defining JFK's deteriorating relations with the national security establishment. This is the finding of Dr. John Newman in volume 2 of his JFK series titled Countdown to Darkness. I concur with his assessment that the Bay of Pigs was the major fault line. And as he says, here are 3 of the aftershocks that came directly out of the Bay of Pigs. The first was a final no decision by JFK not to intervene in Laos. Then came Operation Northwoods in 1962, in which the Joint Chiefs offered up pretexts, lies for a U.S. invasion of Cuba, lies to justify a U.S. invasion of Cuba. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis itself in October of '62 was another aftershock from the Bay of Pigs. Now, the Joint Chiefs, the National Security Council, and hawks in the State Department all pushed JFK to the brink over Laos in March of '61. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, JFK's mistrust of the Pentagon military leadership and the civilian hawks in government was very high. And Kennedy opted in late April of '61, after the Bay of Pigs disaster, not to intervene with U.S. combat troops in Laos. We'll be talking about that in a moment. Immediately after his no intervention decision over Laos, the national security establishment pressured him continuously, and I mean continuously, from May of 1961 through the 3rd week in November in 1961 to commit U.S. combat troops to South Vietnam. This pressure was unrelenting. One proposal after another, one series of warnings after another, one scheme after another to try to get JFK to commit combat troops to South Vietnam from May through November. JFK successfully resisted calls for war in Cuba and Southeast Asia, and he held the line in Berlin in defense of NATO treaty obligations, in defense of the one place he believed was worth defending, by going to war if necessary. Now, please understand that if Richard Nixon had been president, the United States would surely have found itself at war in both Cuba and in Southeast Asia in 1961. There can be no doubt about that. Now, I've got 4 slides here that are an overview of the Bay of Pigs. I'm not going to read every word to you because you can freeze the picture at any time and study these in greater detail, but let's study the highlights of each slide, the important points. So Eisenhower approved regime change, overthrowing the Castro regime on March 17th, 1960. And then in August, he approved an expansion of the plan into a paramilitary invasion and provided funding for it. This is all under Eisenhower's watch. On November 3rd, just before the presidential election, the special group augmented, you're going to hear that term a lot. That's the special group augmented of the National Security Council. So if you hear SGA, that means the subset of the National Security Council that approved and authorized covert operations. That's what the SGA did. It kept the president out of the loop on those things and allowed him to use plausible deniability, saying, well, I didn't know anything about that, because these things were all approved by the SGA and not directly by Eisenhower. So the SGA admitted to itself that the CIA's plan for a paramilitary invasion, followed by a spontaneous Cuban uprising, could not succeed without the use of overt U.S. military force. They admitted this to themselves in a meeting on November 3rd, 1960. And the people present were representing the Pentagon, the State Department, and included Eisenhower's national security advisor. And then, even more importantly, on November 15th, at an internal CIA meeting of its Cuban task force, the CIA recognized that not only will there be no spontaneous internal uprising to support the invasion, but that their evolving concept of a 1,500 to 3,000 man paramilitary invasion to secure an airstrip in Cuba would be unachievable except as a joint CIA Department of Defense action. Now, here's the important part that John Newman points out in Countdown to Darkness. No part of this conclusion by the CIA was shared with either President Eisenhower or with President-elect Kennedy. So after Kennedy's elected in a squeaker, Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell have to decide what to tell him about the paramilitary invasion of Cuba that's in the works. It's Richard Bissell's paramilitary invasion plan. He's the deputy director of plans, which means he's in charge of CIA covert operations. He's overall in charge of those things. And of course, Dulles is the director. He's his immediate boss. So they briefed Kennedy twice, the president-elect, on November 18th and 29th. During the second briefing, Bissell's biographer reveals that he resurrected the fiction that the exile invasion would ignite a spontaneous Cuban uprising. This was supported by Allen Dulles, who was with him during these briefings. This lie was clearly told to avoid having the new president consider canceling the paramilitary invasion. Now, here's a photo of Dulles briefing JFK about this time. Here's one of the few photos available of Richard Bissell. Under his leadership, one good thing happened. The U-2 spy plane was developed by Lockheed for the CIA. And a bad thing happened, very bad thing, the Bay of Pigs operation, as well as another bad thing, CIA attempts to assassinate Castro working through the mafia. Those two bad things happened under Richard Bissell too. And all of those things happened with the full knowledge of Allen Dulles. Now, this is a very busy slide. I just want to hit the highlights. I say, meanwhile, the CIA was attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro. This idea first surfaced internally with a memo from an official named J.C. King. He was the head of the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division. So he wrote a memo on December 11th, 1959, before Eisenhower even directed regime change. He wrote a memo saying we should assassinate Castro. Allen Dulles changed the wording of parts of the memo. He sanitized some of the wording, but he approved it. He approved the assassination plan. And then in August of 1960, as I indicate here, Richard Bissell decided to recruit the American mafia to do the job, to assassinate Fidel, using a Howard Hughes employee, Robert Mayhew, as the cutout. Now, I want you to remember one key point from this slide. It's in the middle of the slide here in brown. On two occasions, and two occasions only, in January 61, right after JFK took over as president, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Lyman Lemnitzer, gave JFK honest assessments about the paramilitary Cuban exile invasion, twice. Twice, he indicated that this could not succeed due to Castro's greatly increased military strength, because Castro had been receiving conventional weapons from the Soviet bloc for 6 months. So on the second of these two meetings, Lemnitzer asked the question, with the president in the room, who would come to their aid shortly after these Cuban exiles landed on the beachhead? He said, we could land them, but who will come to their aid when they get stuck on the beach and they're about to be repulsed? And JFK did not take the bait. This is what John Newman writes about in his book, Countdown to Darkness. JFK did not take the bait. At this second meeting, Dulles admitted that the Pentagon's position was that no currently authorized course of action could succeed in overthrowing the Castro regime. So he's openly admitting, Dulles is, at this early stage, that the Pentagon says our plan can't work. That's their position. But on February 3rd, the whole game plan changed. Because JFK had made clear the fact that he had no desire to put U.S. troops in Cuba, to bail out any paramilitary invasion, or to invade Cuba with our own resources, the whole game plan changed, and the Joint Chiefs changed their tune. They wrote a report for Secretary of Defense McNamara on February 3rd saying, quote, evaluation of the current plan results in a favorable assessment, end quote. And they further stated, quote, despite the shortcomings pointed out in the assessment, the Joint Chiefs of Staff consider that timely execution of this plan has a fair chance of ultimate success, end quote. Now, this phrase was inserted by the head of the Joint Staff, General Earl Wheeler, who later became Chief of Staff of the Army, and then after that became Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So he inserted this phrase, fair chance of success, during the postmortem conducted by Maxwell Taylor after the Bay of Pigs disaster. He determined that the phrase fair chance of success meant only a 30% chance of success and a 70% chance of failure. So it's weasel wording, double talk, and it's a lie put in this report. On March 11th, President Kennedy, agreeing with his Secretary of State, expressed discomfort with the chosen site for the invasion, Trinidad on the south coast of Cuba, and said it was too noisy, too public, too much like a World War II invasion. He wanted it moved to another site. The only site the CIA proposed to him was the Bay of Pigs, and so he ended up approving the Bay of Pigs. Once he did that, General Gray on the Joint Staff estimated that the chances of success had dropped from 30% chance of success to 20% by moving into the Bay of Pigs. Of course, no one told the president. Now, the realities are this. Back in November, the CIA was talking about a plan of securing an airstrip with their Cuban exiles, a force of 1,500 to 3,000 men. In reality, when the invasion took place, there were only 1,400 men involved, 1,400 men. And they had hoped it would be 1,500 to 3,000. All they could scrape up was 1,400. They were going up against a defending army, Cuban army of 32,000 men at the time, supported by a militia of 200,000 men, all recently bolstered by large arms shipments. And of course, it's true that the number of airstrikes planned were reduced, primarily by Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, and later one was canceled by the president. But that's an asterisk to history, in my view. The airstrike business did not change the overall chances for success or failure. The invading force was grossly insufficient to accomplish the objective, based on the numbers I just gave you. And it was based on a big lie. And the big lie was that there would be a spontaneous public uprising that would help topple Castro, and that the invasion would simply trigger the spontaneous uprising. But both the CIA and the Pentagon knew that was untrue, and they never told President Kennedy. So as Castro became aware of the impending invasion, he began to publicly protest that the U.S. is planning an invasion of Cuba. JFK went public and announced that no U.S. military forces would be used to invade Cuba. He said this not only to maintain plausible deniability about the forthcoming exile invasion, but he meant it as well. The problem is, the military and CIA advisors did not believe that he meant it when he said no U.S. forces would be used to invade Cuba. Alan Dulles wrote later in an unpublished article, quote, "We felt that when the chips were down, when the crisis arose in reality, any action required for success would be authorized rather than permit the enterprise to fail," end quote. This has caused David Talbot, in his book, The Devil's Chessboard, to conclude that not only was the Bay of Pigs doomed to fail, but that it was designed to fail. Excuse me. News analyst Daniel Shore, formerly of CBS and later of NPR Radio, stated on the radio after attending a Bay of Pigs conference in Havana that, in effect, President Kennedy was the target of a CIA covert operation that collapsed when the invasion collapsed. Excuse me. So summing up the Bay of Pigs debacle, I'm going to quote what John Newman wrote in Countdown to Darkness. It's the best summary I've read anywhere of what happened. Quote, President Kennedy had made it clear to his subordinates that he would not, under any circumstances, commit the U.S. military forces to action in Cuba. Yet Dulles and the Chiefs did not believe their commander-in-chief. They were certain that once the Exile Brigade was pinned down and being slaughtered on the beachhead, Kennedy would have to give in. The Chiefs had lied about their professional position on the CIA plan. It was a disgraceful, disloyal, and insubordinate performance, end quote. So the debacle was a major international embarrassment for the United States. And the problem was it established a pattern of intentional lying to and the withholding of key information from the chief executive in a brazen attempt to manipulate him into a course of action that everyone knew he did not endorse. This is exactly what happened between them and JFK over Vietnam in the coming 2.5 years. Lying to him about what was happening in Vietnam and withholding key information from him in an attempt to manipulate him into taking a course of action that he naturally opposed. So this one event, over 3 months in the making, destroyed almost all trust between President Kennedy and his key CIA and Pentagon advisors at the very beginning of his administration. The aftermath, I've got 2 slides here. The 2 most famous quotes that came out of Kennedy's mouth were, "I am the responsible officer of the government," and "Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." He did not shift the blame to others, although he was inwardly furious. Furious with himself for approving it, even more furious with those who had misled him and lied to him and tried to manipulate him. As soon as he said, "I'm the responsible officer of the government," and took responsibility in public, his approval ratings went up to the mid-70 percentages. Something like 74 or 78%. It was unbelievable that his approval went up after he made that statement. But that shows that the American people respect honesty and candor in their public officials. Now, we learned in 1966 in a New York Times article that shortly after the Bay of Pigs, JFK said, quote, he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, end quote. That's what he said in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And he moved quietly to cut their budget in 62 and 3 and aimed for actually a substantial cut in their budget of 20% by 1966. Of course, he never had a chance to do that. The 3 top-level CIA officials who were in charge during the Bay of Pigs were fired. He didn't do it immediately, but they knew they were marked men. Allen Dulles was finally let go in November 61. General Charles Cabell, U.S. Air Force, was the deputy director of Central Intelligence. He was let go in January 62. And Richard Bissell, the designer of the invasion, was finally let go after a long delay in February of 62. Now, presidential aides Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers later wrote their own memoir, Johnny We Hardly Knew You. And in it, there's a long quote here of what Kennedy said to them about what happened. And he said to them, quote, they were sure I'd give in to them and send the go-ahead order to the aircraft carrier Essex, he said one day to Dave Powers. They couldn't believe that a new president like me wouldn't panic and try to save his own face. Well, they had me figured all wrong. And then, as General Douglas MacArthur remarked privately to the president, He was lucky to have learned so much about the value of his military advice from an operation like the Bay of Pigs disaster, where the strategic cost was so small. Now, here's a picture from 1955 of two of the three CIA officials JFK fired after the Bay of Pigs. On the left is DCI Allen Dulles. On the far right is Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Lieutenant General Charles Cabell. By the way, his brother was mayor of Dallas in 1963 when JFK was assassinated there. And then left of center is U.S. Air Force Colonel Ed Lansdale. He'll come up a lot during this presentation. A Dulles protege and a counterinsurgency expert. That's him at the center left when he's a colonel in the Air Force. So on aftermath slide number 2, the first quote is a very angry JFK talking to Red Fay. Red Fay was an ex-Navy buddy of JFK's. He served with him in PT boats, the PT boat service. And Red Fay wrote a book, The Pleasure of His Company, in 1966. So the first is an angry quote Kennedy made after discussing a lot of the criticism over how he handled the Bay of Pigs, saying, "I'm not going to kill innocent women and children, and I'm not going to take a chance of starting a nuclear war unless it's really necessary." So you can read that later. And then below is a much more measured quote when JFK was less angry, and this one is worth reading. Quote, "Looking back on that whole Cuban mess, one of the things that appalled me the most was the lack of broad judgment by some of the heads of the military services," said JFK. "When you think of the long competitive selection process that they have to weather to end up the number one man of their particular service, it is certainly not unreasonable to expect that they would also be bright with good broad judgment. For years, I've been looking at those rows of ribbons and those 4 stars and conceding a certain higher qualification not obtained in civilian life. Well, if Lemnitzer and Burke are the best the services can produce, a lot more attention is going to have to be given to their advice in the future before any action is taken as a result of it. They wanted to fight and probably calculated that if we committed ourselves partway and started to lose, I would give the okay to pour in whatever was needed. I found out, among other things, that when it comes to making decisions, I want facts more than advice. I can see now why McNamara wants to get some new faces over there in the Pentagon," end quote. So Kennedy did put Chief of Naval Operations Arleigh Burke out to pasture on August 1st, 1961. Lyman Lemnitzer, he's chairman of the Joint Chiefs, after a long, tempestuous relationship with JFK, was finally replaced as chairman of the JCS on October 1st, 1962. Unfortunately, instead of allowing or forcing him to retire from the military, JFK put him back in Europe as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces. More about that later. So Red Fay didn't want to mention their specific names in that paragraph in his book. He left the names blank between brackets. But I know who he was talking about, and all the historians who've studied his book know who he's talking about. He's talking about Lemnitzer and Burke. You can tell a lot about these men, not only from the minutes of National Security Council meetings and by studying cables sent, official telegrams, but just from their body language. I mean, look at Lemnitzer. You can see displayed here a certain inflexibility. And Burke, my goodness, he was Chief of Naval Operations way too long, 3 full terms, and was pretty sure he had the answers to everything. I mean, just look at him there. He's really full of himself. Meanwhile, an unhappy Allen Dulles would hang around until late November, as I said, just waiting to be fired. And we know this is from later in 61 because Max Taylor's in the picture. Max Taylor was brought out of retirement. He had been Army Chief of Staff in the late 50s when he was forced into retirement for disagreeing with Eisenhower. Eisenhower didn't want to pay for large conventional military forces. He wanted to rely on overwhelming nuclear retaliation upon that doctrine to defend the U.S. and to save on military expenditures. And Taylor had argued for a larger conventional army, so he had been forced into retirement and wrote a book about it. But he got back into the halls of power by agreeing to visit with JFK at Kennedy's request and do a postmortem on the Bay of Pigs. So that's why he's in this photograph. Now I've got 3 slides here on Laos, and I'll just summarize this one by saying that following the middle of March, after being pressed to send combat troops there, an unpersuaded JFK decided, well, I'll preposition some forces in the area to try to force the Pathet Lao, the communists, to the negotiating table. Eisenhower, had told JFK he would have to introduce U.S. combat troops into Laos to save Southeast Asia, but JFK had other plans. He wanted to pursue a diplomatic settlement leading to a coalition government, a neutral Laos. So what he did to try to force the Pathet Lao to the negotiating table was to send 3 aircraft carriers to the South China Sea, a token force of Marines, 150 combat troops into Thailand, and had 2,600 Marines. That's still a pretty small force of troops. But he had 2,600 Marines ready to deploy, based in Okinawa, ready to go under General Harkins, in the event they were needed for combat operations in Laos. And he deferred any final decision on what to do about Laos until after the Bay of Pigs. Well, the Bay of Pigs was a disaster. And I'll just say here that after the Bay of Pigs, Moscow finally agreed to a ceasefire on April 24th. But the response of the Pathet Lao, the guerrilla forces in Laos, was to launch an all-out offensive to grab as much territory as they could before negotiations commenced. This created a panic in Washington and led to a series of crisis meetings between April 26th and May the 2nd. Now, this slide is all about the one meeting that was the worst meeting Walt Rostow ever saw in the Kennedy White House. The worst performance by the military in any meeting he ever attended, and the worst White House meeting he ever attended. Walt Rostow was in charge of the Southeast Asia desk at the National Security Council. He was, in effect, the assistant NSC director working under McGeorge Bundy. On April 27th, because Lemnitzer wasn't in town, he was in Laos at the time, Arleigh Burke was standing in as acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he argued that the U.S. would either lose Southeast Asia without a war, or we'd have to fight a long one and would be forced to use nuclear weapons. And he urged the implementation of CETO Plan 5, major Allied troop commitments, largely American, and warned that U.S. strategic reserves were too low to deploy enough forces to win, and that to win, we'd probably have to use nuclear weapons. And yet he still wanted to go in there. So Burke made emotional appeals. If we don't fight in Laos, where will we fight? Will we fight in Thailand? In Vietnam? Where will we fight and when? Where do we draw the line? Those were his emotional appeals that day to members of the meetings, including the congressional delegation. Now, a different tune was sung by Marine Corps Commandant Shoup and Army Chief of Staff Decker, who warned that the U.S. didn't have the ability to put more than about 1,000 troops a day and their necessary supplies into Laos. That's not very many troops per day. It's because we had a limited airlift capability into Laos. Laos only had 2 usable airfields. And it was a landlocked country with no seaports. So, as I say here, in the event of Chinese intervention in Laos, which was one of the worries we had, the Joint Chiefs recommended seizing Hainan Island, off the coast of North Vietnam, Hainan Island, where there were 3 communist Chinese combat divisions, seizing Hainan Island, deploying 250,000 troops in South Vietnam, launching assaults into Laos through North Vietnamese territory to block Chinese entry, and finally using nuclear weapons if U.S. forces were overrun. That was the Joint Chiefs' collective recommendation that day in the event the Chinese intervened. You keep hearing nuclear weapons over and over. So the overall consensus, in spite of the Pentagon advice, was to not intervene. JFK took no action and agreed that the Joint Chiefs could go back and consult with each other and submit new positions. Important new meetings were held the 29th of April and May the 1st. CNO Arleigh Burke and U.S. Air Force Vice Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay repeatedly recommended the use of nuclear weapons in Laos during the meetings in late April and early May. LeMay is not Chief of Staff of the Air Force yet, but he's been Vice Chief of Staff since 1957, and he's attending a lot of these meetings. And General White, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, is about to retire, and I think LeMay is effectively, for all practical purposes, already taken over. JFK finally says no to combat troops in Laos by simply never approving the recommendations. There was a big brainstorming session on April 29th before an NSC meeting. And as John Newman reveals in his book, JFK in Vietnam, Decker, Chief of Staff of the Army, says, we should have gone in last August of 1960. And Decker says that a conventional war in Laos was unwinnable. And if we go in, it would mean bombing Hanoi and China and perhaps using nuclear weapons. But he wanted to go in anyway. And Burke repeats, the loss of Laos would require the deployment of U.S. forces to Thailand and South Vietnam, and the U.S. might have to throw in the works to win. And by that, he meant nuclear weapons. So there was unanimity now among the chiefs, including Decker, that the U.S. should intervene. They only differed on the details. So JFK, still unsure about what to do and facing a lot of pressure from his military advisors and from hawks, civilian hawks, said, okay, to the Pentagon, you can make preparations to send 2 5,000-man brigades, one into Thailand and one into Da Nang, Vietnam, in support of possible combat operations in Laos. He said, you can make preparations to do that. He never gave permission to deploy those troops. On May the 1st, JFK was shocked when he was informed that the introduction of only 10,000 troops to Southeast Asia would denude American strategic reserves needed to defend Berlin. That was shocking to him because Burke and the chiefs are recommending SEATO Plan 5. SEATO Plan 5 was talking about large numbers, between 250,000 and 500,000 troops, and that we couldn't even spare 10,000 without denuding the reserves needed to defend Berlin. So the idea was essentially dead. And in fact, I'll backtrack a little. Back on the 27th, following the worst meeting Walt Rostow ever saw in the White House, the worst performance by the military, Burke wouldn't take a non-decision for an answer, and he had written a memo demanding intervention and had taken it over to Kennedy in the White House that day on the afternoon of the 27th. And angry Kennedy said to Burke, this is settled, and threw him out of the Oval Office. Now, they had just severely quarreled a week before during the Bay of Pigs fiasco, when Burke ended up screaming at the president, shouting in his face, demanding that he land Marines to bail out the Bay of Pigs and to launch naval airstrikes to bail out the exile invasion, which would have led, of course, to complete U.S. military commitment. So he had screamed at the president about the 19th of April. He was either the 19th or 20th, but had severely clashed with him during that time period. And then now went over with a memo in hand and demanded military intervention in Laos and got thrown out of the Oval Office. So they now had a breach that was irreparable. So JFK said to Arthur Schlesinger, the historian hired as one of his principal policy advisors, quote, "If it hadn't been for Cuba, we might be about to intervene in Laos." Waving a sheaf of cables from Lemnitzer, he said, "I might have taken this advice seriously." And then JFK also said, this time to Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter, "Thank God the Bay of Pigs happened when it did. Otherwise, we'd be in Laos by now, and that would be 100 times worse." So the end result of the bad advice Kennedy got over the Bay of Pigs and Laos was that he scolded the Joint Chiefs twice. As Jim Douglas writes, the first scolding took place in person on May 27th, 1961, when he motored over the Pentagon to do it in person on their turf. That cannot have been a pleasant experience for either him or them. The second scolding took place in a written document, NSAM 55, National Security Action Memo 55, signed personally by the president. Most NSAMs are not signed by the president. This is one of the few exceptions that was signed by him to give it special emphasis. And I'll read the operative text of this one. Quote, "I look to the chiefs to contribute dynamic and imaginative leadership in contributing to the success of the military and paramilitary aspects of Cold War programs. I expect the Joint Chiefs of Staff to present the military viewpoint in governmental councils in such a way as to assure that the military factors are clearly understood before decisions are reached. I regard them to be more than military men and expect their help in fitting military requirements into the overall context of any situation," end quote. In other words, stop coming to important meetings unprepared and stop giving me half-assed advice. That's what this memo is saying in official language. Now, these three NSAMs delivered that day were drafted in large part by Maxwell Taylor, who had been brought back into the service of government by Kennedy, as I said, to do a postmortem on the Bay of Pigs. The other two NSAMs were NSAMs 56 and 7, which, to make a long story short, placed all large paramilitary covert operations under the Pentagon now instead of the CIA. So if there was going to be another Bay of Pigs-sized operation, another paramilitary invasion, whether it was overt or covert, it would now belong to the Pentagon. And the CIA would only keep small covert operations, which were totally secret and disallowable, and which were within the normal capabilities of the agency. Now, the next two slides are very busy. I'm just going to summarize them very quickly. You can freeze the picture and study them in depth if you'd like, or you can come back and revisit them later. There was a full court press on JFK, as I mentioned earlier, from May through November '61 to commit combat troops to Vietnam. It went on incessantly. Toward the end of this full court press, he sent his personal military advisor, Kennedy did, Maxwell Taylor, and Walt Rostow of the National Security Council. He sent them over to Vietnam in October to do a study and come back and provide a report to him. He made it very clear before they departed that he did not want a recommendation for combat troops in South Vietnam. You know, Taylor wrote the written guidelines for his trip. Kennedy seriously revised those written guidelines and made it very clear that he considered the South Vietnamese responsible for their own fate and that they could come back and recommend a lot of things, but that combat troops should not be one of them. So they came back and recommended combat troops. These two high-level officials disobeyed the president, and he was so displeased that he attempted to suppress all final copies of their report. So here's Maxwell Taylor who disobeyed his instructions, and Walt Rostow on the right. 2 interventionists in South Vietnam, insisting that the U.S. deploy combat troops. Their report recommended that we introduce 8,000 combat troops under cover of flood relief. So there would be a fig leaf to justify it. But this was the foot in the door approach, which the Joint Chiefs had been discussing for months. Let's just get our foot in the door, and later it'll be impossible for the United States to withdraw or for the president to change his mind. Kennedy was very unhappy. He was so unhappy that he clashed with Lemnitzer in an important meeting on November 15th. And as the minutes of the NSC Security Council meeting reveal, quote, Kennedy asked, how could Lemnitzer justify the proposed courses of action in Vietnam while at the same time ignoring Cuba? General Lemnitzer hastened to add that the JCS feel that even at this point, the United States should go into Cuba, end quote. As John Newman has written, quote, for Kennedy, Saigon was no Berlin. It illuminates the degree to which the president had become isolated from the Cold Warriors demanding a similar commitment to Vietnam. It is also a reminder of the lingering mutual animosity and grudges that sprang from the debacle in Cuba, end quote. Now, a major NSAM was signed out on November 22nd, 1961, NSAM 111. It ended up being JFK's final policy position on Vietnam for the years 61, 62, and most of 63. And what it did is it provided no combat troops for Vietnam, in spite of the Taylor-Rostow recommendation, and no guarantees to save South Vietnam from communism. It did offer a significant increase in American advisors and equipment, and that increase did take place rapidly in 1962. Many more advisors and equipment. So when the Eisenhower presidency ended, there were less than 1,000 advisors, and by the end of 63, there were a little over 16,000, but still no combat troops. John Newman has written, quote, Kennedy turned down combat troops not when the decision was clouded by ambiguities, but when the battle was unequivocally desperate, when all concerned agreed that Vietnam's fate hung in the balance, and when its principal advisors told him that vital U.S. interests in the region and in the world were at stake, end quote. So beginning on November 26th and continuing through a 4-day period, we have the Thanksgiving Day Massacre, where Kennedy made numerous personnel changes on the NSC staff, in the State Department, and in the CIA. A major reshuffle which removed hawks from positions he did not any longer want them in, and blunting their influence by placing them in less important positions. That included Walt Rostow being removed from the NSC and put in the State Department, and it involved internal shuffles within the State Department, putting hawks in less influential positions and putting others who didn't support combat troops in Vietnam in more important positions. Now, on November 27th, 1961, JFK chaired a meeting at which he invited those hawks who had particularly annoyed him throughout the year, including Lemnitzer, Taylor, Lansdale, Rostow, Dean Rusk, Hugh Alexis Johnson, the Bundy brothers, and last but not least, Allen Dulles on his last day as CIA director. McGeorge Bundy was his National Security Advisor, and William Bundy had a position as one of the Assistant Secretaries of Defense. They were both hawks. So JFK unloaded his frustrations over the lack of support for his Vietnam policy, which clearly was that it was primarily the people of South Vietnam who were responsible for their fate, not the United States. He said, quote, "When policy is decided on, people on the spot must support it or get out." He ordered that there be, quote, "wholehearted support," end quote, for his decisions. When JFK asked who at the Defense Department would be responsible for carrying out his Vietnam policy, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara loyally said, "Myself and L." Now, L meant Lemnitzer, but Kennedy didn't value his judgment at this point and wasn't really listening to him much anymore. McNamara knew this, and so it really meant McNamara saying, "I will. I'll implement your policy." And although McNamara had been an early interventionist, he supported JFK's position throughout 62 and 3, which was no combat troops. And throughout 1963, from April through November, McNamara supported JFK's withdrawal plans. He was very loyal to JFK's withdrawal plans to pull out of Vietnam. Now, we've all been critical, almost all of us, of McNamara's performance under LBJ, where he flipped and decided to support the introduction of combat troops. But in 62 and 63, he was very loyal to John F. Kennedy. So I've got 5 slides here in Berlin. John Newman covered this extensively in his presentation. And so I'm just going to summarize 1 or 2 points on each slide and keep moving here. Because of the Bay of Pigs and the weakness Khrushchev felt Kennedy had displayed by not bailing out the exile invasion with US power, he decided to ambush Kennedy at the Vienna summit in June. That's where Khrushchev declared his intent to sign a peace treaty with the Soviet-occupied portion of Germany, which was East Germany. That's the Soviet occupation zone. Declare a peace treaty with them, thus recognize them as an independent state. And by doing so, he would accomplish 2 objectives. The first one was he would ensure that Germany would never become a reunited state again. And number 2, as he told Kennedy, Western access rights to the city of West Berlin will be terminated. The access rights of the French, the British, and the Americans to West Berlin, which is, 110 miles inside the borders of East Germany. Your rights will be terminated. Too bad. So this is what the Soviets were afraid of. They were afraid that the Western powers would eventually support the unification of Germany back into one country, and that the Western powers would rearm Germany with nuclear weapons. They were terrified of that possibility. Plus, there was a brain drain going on. By the summer of 63, over 1,000 people a day, some days over 1,500 people, from the Eastern Bloc and especially from East Germany, leaving the Eastern Bloc through the checkpoints in Berlin, walking over the line to West Berlin, and then moving into West Germany. So he had to stop the brain drain, or East Germany would not much longer be viable as a society or as a nation. So here are 2 pictures from the Vienna summit. Kennedy looking, quite frankly, ill at ease. Khrushchev looking like he's in the catbird seat, like he's in full control. And I think the pictures speak for themselves. Kennedy admitted afterwards to insiders that it was the worst thing in his life, and he felt like he got beat up. And he really wasn't prepared for the brutality Khrushchev displayed. He had been warned of it by de Gaulle, but he wasn't really prepared for that. He thought he could have a rational discussion with Khrushchev, and of course Khrushchev played the bully at this conference and threatened war if he didn't get his way. So during the conference, Khrushchev had told Kennedy, "I want peace, but if you want war, that's your problem." And Kennedy, in a much more rational frame of mind, a cooler tone of voice, said, "Well, it is you that are desiring a great change, not I." He said, "It'll be a cold winter." So that was the kind of fireworks they exchanged the second day of the Vienna summit. The second day of the Vienna summit discussing Berlin. So moving on here, Kennedy came home and on June the 6th, made a reassuring speech to the nation about the summit, trying to explain that he made clear to Khrushchev that the West was very serious about our access rights to West Berlin and that they're not based on sufferance, that we're determined to maintain those rights at any risk. He then established an ad hoc committee. He was fond of ad hoc interdepartmental coordinating committees. It included Secretary of State Rusk, McNamara, Paul Nitze, there's that name again, author of NSC 68, and former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, there's that name again. The hawk of all hawks, Dean Acheson, invited by Kennedy. And at this time, Nitze's, he's got a position as an Assistant Secretary of Defense. He's no longer with State. So Acheson dominates these discussions for the next month and a half. And he issues a report on June 28th, and strongly recommends that JFK declare a national emergency and prepare for a conventional war by openly and rapidly increasing our forces in Europe, and by preparing for nuclear war publicly to show the Soviets were serious. So he not only viewed the Berlin problem as international chicken, but he thought we should be able to be willing to go to war there if necessary, and should do so. JFK sent a very strong signal to the USSR on June 30th when he promoted the bellicose U.S. Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay, to become the new Air Force Chief of Staff. And here's a picture from the Kennedy Library of the swearing in on June 30th. As I write here, because of his combat record and his lethal administration of SAC during the 1950s, JFK felt LeMay was the right man to lead the Air Force during the Berlin crisis. The trouble is that at the time this photo was taken, LeMay had already described Kennedy as a coward in a background interview with journalist Fletcher Nebel, who then co-authored the book 7 Days in May, the best-selling novel about an attempted military coup in the United States. That's how disturbed Nebel was about the rumors of friction between JFK and the military leadership following the Bay of Pigs and the Laos debacles. That's how disturbed he was after the way LeMay described Kennedy as a coward while he was Vice Chief of Staff. That was rank disloyalty. So as we continue here, what Kennedy and McNamara were able to do was create 6 additional Army divisions and 2 additional Marine divisions within the United States without having to deploy them to Europe, and thus scaring the hell out of everybody, including the European countries they would be housed in, the American public, and without looking like we were engaging in extreme escalation. So we sent responsible signals that, yes, we're creating 6 new Army divisions and 2 additional Marine divisions here at home for deployment in case we need to deploy them. Both sides of the Berlin problem increased military spending during the summer in a game of one-upsmanship. And the U.S. did eventually call up 90,000 Air Force and Navy reservists. They were called on active duty and deployed to Europe. But the 6 new Army divisions and 2 additional Marine divisions were kept in the continental U.S. ready to go on a moment's notice. Kennedy thought sending him over there would actually escalate the crisis more than he wanted to. He didn't want to escalate it. So Kennedy made a major foreign policy speech about Berlin on July 25th. There are 3 famous quotes that come out of the speech. The first one is, the NATO shield was long ago extended to cover West Berlin, and we have given our word that an attack upon that city will be regarded as an attack upon us all. Here's another quote. Above all, it has now become, as never before, the great testing place of Western courage and will, end quote. And then finally, quote, we cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force, end quote. Now, as John Newman discussed in his lecture on August 13th, the East Germans, with Soviet permission and encouragement, began erecting the long planned for Berlin Wall. First with barbed wire, and then with concrete blocks, and then with minefields. And a double set of walls filled with a minefield in between the walls. And guard towers and orders to shoot, things like that. This certainly did solve the brain drain problem, excuse me. The brain drain came to an abrupt stop. The number of people escaping from East Berlin into West Berlin dropped to almost zero. And as JFK privately remarked, it's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. Conservatives in the US blamed Kennedy for not tearing down the wall. But the wall was built on East German territory. The territory of, specifically of the East Berlin, the city of East Berlin, it was built on their territory. And to do so would have commenced conventional hostilities, conventional war. And Kennedy wasn't about to do that because the numbers of Red Army troops in and around Berlin and East German troops in and around Berlin greatly exceeded the numbers of Allied troops inside West Berlin. And the numbers of Red Army troops in East Germany greatly exceeded the numbers of NATO troops in West Germany. So he didn't want to start that kind of a conventional war because it would have required us to use nuclear weapons. And that's the last thing he wanted to do. So here are pictures from the speech and the famous quote, we cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force. So he gave the speech. He tried to strike a determined but sober tone without escalating the crisis. And I think he succeeded. And history has shown that he did succeed. So on August 18th, JFK sent a symbolic military resupply convoy of about 1,600 men on the Autobahn through 110 miles of East German territory from West Germany into West Berlin. After a couple of pro forma delays, face-saving delays for the East Germans, the convoy was allowed to go through and was met in West Berlin by Vice President Johnson and former General Lucius Clay, who was recalled by Kennedy to be his special representative in Berlin during the crisis. The West Germans liked General Clay because he'd been a tough guy in 1948 when he was military governor and when Stalin had blockaded ground access to Berlin. So ominously, with Berlin as the backdrop, the USSR announced on August 30th that it would drop the voluntary moratorium on nuclear testing that it had begun in March 1958. They had begun the moratorium, and it had later been joined in October by Eisenhower. And since that time, nuclear tests in the atmosphere of the planet between the two superpowers had stopped. So they announced they were going to abandon the moratorium. They're upping the ante and trying to scare the West. So JFK's private response was an impassioned expletive, which I won't read here. And he reluctantly followed suit and broke the US moratorium in late April 1962, after which we did over 100 tests. In the ensuing year, we did over 100 tests. But he delayed quite a while. He didn't break our moratorium after the Soviets did in August. He waited until the pressure on him was considerable and until he really had no choice politically. Now, because there were great fears of a conventional war breaking out over Berlin and then escalating to nuclear war, there were discussions between Bob McNamara at Defense and General Norstad in the fall of '61, and even between Kennedy and Norstad. And the problem with General Norstad is he was operating almost as a potentate in Europe. He had been the supreme Allied commander of the NATO forces in Europe. He had been SACEUR for over 5 years. And he felt it was his prerogative to use nuclear weapons if and when the situation dictated, and that he would escalate to their use when required and didn't need to seek anybody's permission. Well, this really disturbed McNamara a lot. And so in a 2004 video interview, McNamara said, quote, "The stated NATO policy and the stated US policy with respect to nuclear weapons was that we would initiate their use in the event of some conventional military force action by the Soviets or Warsaw Pact against the West." Of course, he's talking about pertaining to West Berlin. "I said to the president, quote, Mr. President, this is the US stated policy, this is the stated NATO policy, but never, never, never follow that, end quote. The stated nuclear policy of the US was wrong, and it's wrong today," he said in 2004. So he was very concerned about Norstad's finger being on the nuclear trigger, which didn't seem to bother Norstad at all. This belief that we could use tactical nuclear weapons against Soviet soldiers and not stimulate a general nuclear war. Now, as John Newman mentioned earlier, on October 25th, a tense standoff between Soviet and American tanks took place before the eyes of the world at Checkpoint Charlie. And as Newman pointed out, this was brought under control behind the scenes by JFK and Khrushchev working through intermediaries. But on this one day and into the next day, it was very scary. And the world thought we were going to have a conventional war start between the Russians and Americans inside Berlin, and then it would quickly escalate to nuclear war. It turns out to have been a threat display, an exercise in contrived theatricality, as one author has called it. But if it had not been successfully managed behind the scenes, conventional warfare could easily have erupted, and that could quickly have escalated into nuclear war. So here's a picture of McNamara and his antagonist on this issue of use of nukes to defend Berlin and West Germany, Lawrence Norstad. McNamara and Rusk met together with Norstad at one point that fall, and they were treated very rudely by him. This man had a tremendous ego and tremendous authority in the field. And he essentially told them, well, this interview is terminated. But McNamara got up and walked out of the room and slammed the door as loud as he could. So McNamara and Kennedy were becoming increasingly aware in the fall of '61 that they didn't necessarily have full control over the nuclear arsenal. And they found this extremely disturbing. And of course it was. So here's JFK consulting that fall with Norstad and Lemnitzer. So just prior, 4 days prior to the tank standoff in Berlin at Checkpoint Charlie, 4 days before that, on October 21st, 1961, Deputy Secretary of Defense, the number 2 man, Roswell Gilpatrick, was authorized to give a major speech announcing to the world, which means to the Soviets, that there is a missile gap and there is a bomber gap, but it's not in the Russians' favor, it's in America's favor. And Kennedy had not intended it to be provocative or escalatory. He had intended it to be sobering, to let the Russians know that you don't dare start a war over Berlin because it'll have the most dire consequences for you. So in the speech, I think the key line is that Gilpatrick says, quote, In short, we have a second strike capability, which is at least as extensive as what the Soviets can deliver by striking first, end quote. So in the speech, he cites numbers of heavy bombers and superior numbers of US missiles, and et cetera, et cetera. And it unintentionally did have an escalatory effect on the Russians because it seriously influenced their behavior throughout 1962 and led to the Soviets placing missiles in Cuba to try to redress this imbalance that Gilpatrick went public about. The Soviets always suspected this was the case, but he removed any doubt. And it was actually much worse. The imbalance was much worse than he said in the speech. He mentioned 600 heavy long-range bombers. We really had 1,500 bombers that could deliver nuclear weapons inside Russia. He only mentioned the heavy bombers, the B-52s. We also had almost 900 B-47s and over 70 B-58s. And so our total was really almost 1,500. He just mentioned the heavy bombers. And of course, we had in-flight refueling. The Soviets didn't have nearly that many bombers and no in-flight refueling, so they had no means of, their intercontinental ballistic missiles were very few in number and were not reliable yet. And the reason we finally made this speech is that our continued surveillance of the Soviet Union by the Corona satellites had continued. It began, in August of 1960 with the first pictures sent back from outer space, literally sent back by film in a return satellite vehicle, reentry vehicle, did not detect any missile launching sites at all in August 60. But in the summer of 61, the photographs revealed that they have almost no launching sites, only 2, I think, launch sites for nuclear missiles, and they have very few missiles. So this gave us the confidence to make this speech. And we went public with it, and it scared the hell out of the Soviets. Now, after this speech, and as the curtain rang down on the year, Khrushchev stopped talking about a deadline for signing a peace treaty with East Germany. He suddenly stopped mentioning that in his speeches to the communist world. That was a signal that he no longer put a deadline on it, and he was still talking the talk, but he wasn't walking the walk anymore. And what he did instead was try to scare the hell out of everybody. So he responds to the Gilpatrick speech with a massive nuclear test that he had actually ordered before Gilpatrick's speech, but the response came after the speech. So to the world, it looked like a response, a direct response to the speech. And it was the Tsar bomb, the Tsar Bomba, he called it. The Soviets have been working on a massive thermonuclear hydrogen bomb of 100 megatons in yield, working on it since 1956. But because they imposed a moratorium on testing in early 58, they never tested the weapon. So he ordered, during the Berlin crisis, to go ahead and test the weapon, test the 100 megaton bomb. And then he was advised, well, we really shouldn't do that, Mr. Chairman. There'll be too much nuclear fallout if we do the full Monty, 100 megatons. Let's make it 50 megatons. That way we won't have as much nuclear fallout descending on our own citizens. So he said, okay, 50 megatons. So that was the plan. This was still a massive weapon, bigger than any hydrogen bomb test we had conducted. The largest hydrogen bomb test we ever conducted was 15 megatons, 15. This was going to be 50. And it was going to be 1,570 times more powerful than the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan combined. 1,570 times more powerful than those 2 bombs combined. That's how dangerous hydrogen bombs are. Here we go. Here's a picture of the bomb casing for the Tsar bomb. Even though the Soviets thought they were lowering its yield to 50 megatons, We were surveilling it closely, and we estimated afterwards that the actual yield was much higher. It was 57 to 58 megatons. This was a serious concern at this time with the testing of hydrogen bombs. There were many different designs. Each one was new and experimental, each new design. And one of our own nuclear bomb tests, called Castle Bravo, in 1954 had scared the hell out of us because it ended up being 2.5 times more powerful than we had estimated it would be. So we have these nuclear physicists acting like the sorcerer's apprentice in the cartoon, playing with things they don't fully understand and creating weapons that are much more powerful than they intended on some occasions. It's really a scary situation to look back on. Now here are some very disturbing images for you. This is a photograph of the Tsar Bomba mushroom cloud, taken from 100 miles away. Think about what that means. This is taken from an airplane 100 miles away from the explosion as the mushroom cloud goes up well above the stratosphere. And then the Soviets found out the hard way through the destruction of all the buildings at their nearby test site that the total destructive blast radius from this weapon was 35 kilometers. Now that's the blast radius that destroyed every building, including cement buildings. The blast diameter was 70 kilometers. So on this diagram on the right is a 70-kilometer blast diameter imposed over the city of Paris. That's the area in which every concrete building would have been destroyed if this bomb had been dropped on Paris. Pretty frightening stuff. They wanted to scare the hell out of the world, and they did. Never mind, it was too big to put on a rocket. They didn't have any rocket that could carry a weapon that heavy, but they could put it on a heavy bomber that was specially modified. That bomber never would have reached the United States. None of their heavy bombers would in this period. They never would have made it, but they could have destroyed European cities, that's for sure. So nuclear war and worldwide destruction was a distinct possibility during JFK's presidency. He was briefed on the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the SIOP, for the first time on July 20th, 1961, in the middle of the Berlin crisis, 5 days before he gave his big speech. And this nuclear war plan was called SIOP 62. This was given by what they called the Net Evaluation Subcommittee of the National Security Council. And the briefing was given by a military officer who was in charge of the Net Evaluation Subcommittee. And this plan had been several years in the making by the US Air Force. And McGeorge Bundy later wrote that it was a massive, total, comprehensive, obliterating strategic attack on everything red. It called for the overwhelming destruction of all communist bloc nations, not just the Soviet Union, but little Albania, North Korea, North Vietnam, and China, even though China didn't have any nuclear weapons yet. There were no holdback provisions in the plan where the president could say, okay, we're going to a nuclear war, but I want you to hold back part of the attack. There's no authorized way to do that at this time. The plan was Wagnerian, orgiastic, and genocidal, and it offered no flexibility. During the briefing, now listen to this, Kennedy was presented with a plan for a nuclear surprise attack on the Soviet Union, a first strike by the United States. Quote, in late 1963, preceded by a period of heightened tensions, end quote. This is in the meeting minutes, the NSC minutes of the meeting, which were declassified finally in 1994. And a very famous article was written about that by James K. Galbraith and his co-author. JFK, shocked and disgusted, dramatically got up and walked out in the middle of the briefing. saying to Dean Rusk afterwards, "And we call ourselves the human race." He would receive another PSYOP briefing in September of 1963, which I'll talk about later. He reacted very differently on that occasion. He did not get up and walk out of the meeting. He went toe-to-toe with the briefer and had a long discussion about it and pushed back against the recommendation he got in 63. This was his reaction in 61. Now let's talk about the Curtis LeMay problem. Robert McNamara said in a 2003 video interview in the movie Fog of War, LeMay believed that ultimately we were going to have to confront these people, the USSR, in a conflict with nuclear weapons. And by God, we'd better do it when we have greater superiority than we will have in the future, end quote. Now, LeMay and McNamara did not get along at all. Part of the reason may have been that during World War II, McNamara was a statistician working for LeMay and followed him from Europe over to the Marianas when the firebombing campaign of Japan was launched in late 44, and then especially in great force in the spring of 45. And so he was once working for LeMay. And now the roles are reversed, and he's LeMay's superior as Secretary of Defense. So that may be one reason they didn't get along. Author David Talbot wrote in his book, Brothers, that LeMay predicted at a Washington, D.C. cocktail party in July 61 that nuclear war was inevitable and would break out by the end of the year, and that Washington, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Detroit would be incinerated, as well as most Soviet cities. Can you believe it? This is the month after he's sworn in as Air Force Chief of Staff, and he's saying this at cocktail parties, intentionally scaring the hell out of his social companions, apparently, and apparently delighting in it. Otherwise, why would he bring up the subject? Now, I got a very busy slide here about Curtis LeMay. I really hope you can all find the time to read every word in it. Much of this information comes from the book Dark Sun by Richard Rhodes. Dark Sun is all about two subjects. Number one, the technical development of the hydrogen bomb, how it was different from the fission bomb, the atomic bomb, and why it was so much more powerful, how it was developed, and the politics around developing it, who favored it, who opposed it. It's also a lot about SAC and Curtis LeMay in the 1950s, when LeMay turned the Strategic Air Command into the world's most lethal killing machine ever devised by man. So LeMay was a driven personality who considered that America was already at war with the USSR, and he drilled that mentality into his subordinates at SAC. And Richard Rhodes makes clear that as head of SAC, LeMay repeatedly ordered provocative overflights and incursions into Soviet airspace in an attempt to provoke World War III, something he openly admitted to others. And he was hoping that an overreaction by the USSR would permit SAC to launch a preemptive strike. That was what he hoped for throughout the 1950s. And his philosophy was always to deliver a Sunday punch, an overwhelming offensive attack of more than 80% of his weapons in one big blow that would go on without stop for 3 days. And he expressed seeming regret, poignant regret, in his memoirs that the US had failed to eliminate the Soviet Union in the early to mid-50s, when SAC could have done so, according to LeMay, without any losses except those due to normal flight accidents. His chief of staff at SAC and his self-appointed successor was General Tommy Power, a man that LeMay himself later described as not stable and as a sadist. He made LeMay look like a nice guy. But Kennedy, after meeting with LeMay, would often have a kind of fit and would say to an aide, I don't want that man near me again. Of course, he still had to meet with him from time to time. And part of the language in Kennedy's peace speech was even specifically inserted by JFK to counter what LeMay had said in his speech. And then I talk again here about 7 Days in May and how LeMay was the inspiration for that novel. Happy together, as the song goes, No. The commander-in-chief's meeting with the Air Force Chief of Staff and the new commander of SAC, Tommy Power, during his presidency. They're all making nice for the camera here at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, but they seriously clashed during the missile crisis, these three men. We'll talk about that later. Okay, this is my last slide for 1961. It's very important. I want you to understand that during this year, there was a standoff which I characterize as mutual distrust between JFK and the national security establishment. Now, by the end of 62, by the end of the following year, the relations could be characterized by mutual contempt. But at the end of 61, it was mutual distrust, and I want you to understand how they felt about each other. The first item here, how many military flag officers viewed JFK as weak and indecisive, unable to make up his mind. They viewed Kennedy as fond of delaying tactics when he couldn't make up his mind, fond of ad hoc committees, requests for additional studies. They viewed JFK as afraid to confront communism on the battlefield. And they viewed him as squeamish about the prospect of nuclear war, which many of them viewed as inevitable. How did he view the military senior leadership? As dishonest. They had lied to him when assessing the Bay of Pigs and tried to manipulate him. They were too willing to commit troops into combat situations without adequate staff studies and without considering the big picture. For example, if we go to war in Cuba or Southeast Asia, what effect will it have on our ability to defend Berlin? They were never thinking in those terms. Too many of the senior military leadership, he felt, were empty shells hiding behind their ribbons and the stars on their uniforms and the scrambled eggs on their hats. They lacked critical thinking, they lacked a broad viewpoint of the world, and they lacked nuance when considering or formulating national policy, which bothered him very much. Now, his view of the CIA covert operators, not only Dulles and Bissell, but many of the people under them who had been involved in the Bay of Pigs planning and other people like Sam Halpern and William Harvey, was that they were dishonest. The leadership had all lied to him about the prospects of success for the Bay of Pigs. They weren't worth a damn as far as he was concerned when it came to covert operations. And as we know, he thought the CIA should be splintered into 1,000 pieces. Now, the view of the covert operators at the CIA of Kennedy was very wary. They knew that as a federal agency, they were now in the bullseye, as Kennedy had said to Macron in November 61. They knew that their many years of accountability to anyone were over. And the hawks all throughout government, especially the State Department and NSC, their attitude toward Kennedy and his toward them was one of mutual frustration and impatience. Now, Robert Dallek has summarized the mutual lack of respect between JFK and his chiefs with 3 quotes from his 2013 Atlantic article called JFK versus the Military. The first one, the first thing I'm going to tell my successor is to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that just because they were military men, their opinion on military matters was worth a damn. That's a pretty strong statement. There's an even stronger one. These SOBs with all their fruit salad just sat there nodding during the Bay of Pigs meetings, saying it would all work. Now listen to this one. Lyman Lemnitzer unfairly had compared JFK to Eisenhower. Quote, here was a president who had no military experience at all, sort of a patrol boat skipper from World War II, end quote. How ridiculous is that? Eisenhower was a 5-star general at the end of World War II, a general of the Army and the Supreme Allied Commander for the Normandy invasion. How can you compare anybody to Eisenhower? Lemnitzer himself and Arleigh Burke himself were once junior officers, just like Jack Kennedy. He didn't stay in the military, so he never became a senior officer. They stayed in the military and became senior officers, but it's not fair to compare someone who's a junior officer in 1943 and 44 with a man who became a five-star general. That's an unfair comparison on the surface. And additionally, John Newman has written that Lemnitzer, quote, deplored the tendency of the U.S. government to waste time quibbling over policy, end quote. Well, that's a profoundly unconstitutional point of view. We're supposed to have a military that's under civilian control in this country. This reflects a lack of respect for civilian control of the military. So Dalek wrote, quote, the clash with Arleigh Burke, the tensions over nuclear war planning, and the bumbling at the Bay of Pigs convinced Kennedy that a primary task of his presidency was to bring the military under control, end quote. Nicely put. Okay, this ends 1961, and I'll begin part two just a second.